The most dangerous lie you can ever believe is the one you tell yourself every single day. Ethan said quietly as he stared at his reflection, barely recognizing the person looking back at him, his eyes tired, his shoulders heavy, as if he had been carrying an invisible weight for years without even knowing it. And maybe you felt this too, that moment when life doesn't feel broken on the outside, but something inside you just feels off, like you're drifting without direction, waking up every morning without purpose, going through the motions but feeling nothing, because that's exactly where Ethan was, living in a small apartment barely 600 square feet, scrolling through job listings he didn't believe he deserved, replaying every failure in his mind like a movie he couldn't pause, telling himself the same story over and over again. I'm not good enough. I missed my chance. This is just who I am now. And the scary part is, he didn't question it. He accepted it, because when a thought repeats enough times, it stops feeling like a thought and starts feeling like truth. And that truth slowly shapes how you act, how you speak, how you show up in the world, until one day you don't even realize you've built your entire life around something that was never real to begin with. And Ethan didn't realize it either. Not when he stopped applying for better opportunities, not when he avoided conversations that could lead somewhere, not even when he chose comfort over growth again and again, because in his mind, there was no point trying if he already believed he would fail. So he stayed where he was, stuck in a version of himself he didn't even like, telling himself he was being realistic, when in reality, he was just being controlled by a story he never chose consciously. And every day that passed, that story grew stronger, shaping his habits, his decisions, his future, until one evening, standing alone in front of that mirror, something felt different. Not outside, but inside, like a quiet crack in the belief he had been holding on to for so long. And for the first time in years, instead of looking away, Ethan leaned closer, stared deeper into his own eyes, and asked himself a question he had never dared to ask before. Not, what went wrong? But something far more unsettling. What if I've been wrong about myself this whole time? And that single question, as simple as it sounded, began to shake the very foundation of everything he thought he knew about who he was. The question echoed in Ethan's mind long after he stepped away from the mirror, following him into the quiet corners of his apartment, into the silence that used to feel comfortable but now felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable, as if something inside him had been awakened and refused to go back to sleep. And that night, instead of reaching for his phone or distracting himself like he always did, he sat down on the edge of his bed and let the thoughts come, one after another, not the usual ones, telling him he was not enough, but new ones, sharper, more unsettling, asking him why he believed those things in the first place. Where did that voice come from? Who decided that he was not capable? And for the first time, Ethan did not have an answer, because the truth was, he had never questioned it before. He had simply accepted it, like a rule written somewhere he was never allowed to challenge. And as he sat there, memories started to surface, moments he had ignored, times he had actually done something right, small wins he had dismissed, opportunities he had walked away from not because he could not do them, but because he believed he could not. And slowly, something began to shift, not in his circumstances, not in his bank account, not in his job status, but in the way he was looking at his own story, and it felt strange, almost uncomfortable, like trying to walk in a direction he had never considered before. And yet there was a quiet curiosity growing inside him, a small voice asking, what if the problem was not his ability, but his belief? And that question stayed with him the next morning, when the sunlight came through his window, and for once he did not hit the snooze button right away. He just lay there, staring at the ceiling, thinking, and instead of telling himself the usual things, he paused, caught the thought before it could fully form, and replaced it with something different, something simple, something that did not feel fake, but did not feel familiar either. He said to himself, maybe I can try. And it was not a powerful statement. It was not confidence. It was not certainty, but it was different. And that difference mattered, because for the first time, he was not shutting himself down before even beginning. And that small shift followed him as he got up, as he made his coffee, as he opened his laptop, and when he saw the same job listings that used to make him feel small. He did not close them immediately. He hesitated, his mind still filled with doubt. But now there was something else there too, something new, something that had not been there before, a quiet resistance to the old story, and instead of walking away, Ethan clicked on one application, his hands slightly tense, his heart beating a little faster, not because he believed he would get it, but because he was doing something he had not done in a long time. He was giving himself a chance, and even though it felt small, even though it felt uncertain, that moment marked the beginning of something he could not yet fully see, but something that was already starting to change everything. That single application did not change Ethan's life overnight, and the next few days proved that clearly, because the silence after he hit submit felt familiar. The waiting, the uncertainty, the quiet doubt slowly trying to creep back in, whispering that nothing would come from this, that he was wasting his time, and for a moment, he almost believed it again, but something was different now, because this time he noticed the voice instead of becoming it. He paused, took a breath, and instead of letting that thought take control, he questioned it, asking himself, is that actually true, or is it just what I am used to thinking? And that small moment of awareness gave him just enough space to choose differently. So instead of closing his laptop and retreating back into comfort, he opened another application, then another, each one not perfect, each one filled with hesitation, but each one a step forward. And as the days passed, Ethan began to build a new pattern, not of success yet, but of effort, of showing up even when he did not feel ready. And it was not easy. There were mornings when he still woke up with that heavy feeling in his chest, afternoons where rejection emails landed in his inbox, short and impersonal, reminding him that he was still far from where he wanted to be. And every time that happened, the old voice returned, louder this time, telling him to stop, to go back, to accept where he was, because trying only led to disappointment. But now, Ethan saw it differently, because instead of seeing rejection as proof that he was not good enough, he started to see it as part of the process, something that everyone went through, something that did not define him unless he allowed it to. And this shift, as small as it seemed, began to change how he reacted, how he carried himself, even how he spoke when he practiced answering interview questions alone in his room. His voice at first uncertain, then slowly becoming steadier, clearer, more confident, not because he suddenly believed he was perfect, but because he was no longer convinced that he was a failure. And one afternoon, something unexpected happened. While reviewing one of the applications he had sent earlier, his phone buzzed, and for a second he froze, staring at the screen, his heart beating faster than usual, because deep down, he knew this was different. This was not another rejection. And when he finally answered, his voice calm but his mind racing, he heard words he had not heard in a long time, words that felt almost unfamiliar, an invitation to an interview. And in that moment, standing there in his small apartment, Ethan realized something important. Nothing outside had truly changed yet. He was still in the same place, with the same circumstances, but inside, something had shifted enough to open a door that had always been there, waiting for him to finally believe he could walk through it. The moment the call ended, Ethan stood still, his phone still in his hand, as if moving too quickly might somehow make it disappear, and for a few seconds he did nothing but breathe, trying to process what had just happened, because this was not something he was used to anymore, being seen, being considered, being given a chance. And almost immediately, the old voice returned, quieter than before, but still present, asking, what if you mess this up? What if they realize you are not good enough? What if this is just luck and nothing more? And for a brief moment, Ethan felt that familiar tension in his chest, the urge to retreat, to cancel, to avoid the risk of failing again. But then something else rose alongside that fear, something stronger than before, a memory of the question he had asked himself in front of the mirror. What if I have been wrong about myself this whole time? And this time, instead of letting the doubt take over, he answered it with action, not words, because he knew thinking alone would not change anything unless he followed it with something real. So he sat down at his small kitchen table, opened his laptop, and began to prepare, slowly at first, unsure of where to begin, but determined not to waste the opportunity he had created. He researched the company, read about their values, practiced answering simple questions out loud, his voice still shaking at times, but steadier than it had been days ago. And as the hours passed, something unexpected began to happen. He started to feel engaged, focused, almost curious about what he could do instead of what he lacked. And that shift, subtle but powerful, made the process feel less like a test he had to pass and more like a chance to express who he was becoming, not who he used to believe he was. And the night before the interview, as he stood once again in front of the mirror, the same mirror that once reflected only doubt and exhaustion, he noticed something different, not a complete transformation, not a sudden confidence, but a quiet presence, a sense that he was no longer running away from himself. And when he spoke this time, his voice was calm, not because he was certain of the outcome, but because he was finally willing to face it. And the next morning, as he got dressed and stepped outside, the air felt sharper, the world a little clearer, every step carrying both fear and determination. And as he walked into the building, he realized something important. This moment was not just about getting a job. It was a test of the new story he was beginning to write. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan chose to walk forward instead of turning back. The moment Ethan stepped into the interview room, everything felt quieter than he expected, not because the world had changed, but because something inside him had. And as he sat across from the interviewer, he noticed the familiar tension trying to return, that tight feeling in his chest, the thoughts lining up, ready to remind him of every reason he might fail. But this time, he did not let them take control. He listened, acknowledged them, and then chose to focus on something else, the present moment, the conversation in front of him, the opportunity he had earned. And when the first question came, simple and direct, he answered honestly, not perfectly, not with rehearsed confidence, but with clarity, speaking about his experiences, his struggles, and more importantly, what he had learned from them. And as the conversation continued, something shifted. He stopped trying to impress and started trying to connect. He listened carefully, responded thoughtfully, and allowed himself to be seen as he was, not as the version he once believed he had to hide. And for the first time in a long time, he felt engaged, not overwhelmed, focused, not fearful. And when the interview ended, there was no dramatic moment, no immediate result, just a simple handshake and a quiet thank you. But as he walked out of the building and stepped onto the sidewalk, something inside him felt lighter, not because he knew the outcome, but because he knew he had shown up differently. He had faced something he once avoided, and he had not run. And that realization stayed with him in the hours that followed, as he returned to his apartment, sat down, and replayed the experience in his mind, not with criticism, but with awareness, noticing what he did well, what he could improve, and for once, not attaching his worth to the result. And later that evening, when his phone buzzed again, he picked it up with a calm he had not felt before, and as he read the message, he saw that they had chosen another candidate, a familiar outcome, one that in the past would have sent him back into doubt and silence. But this time, something remarkable happened. He did not collapse into that old story. He paused, took a breath, and recognized the difference. Because even though the result was the same, he was not. And instead of seeing it as failure, he saw it as proof that he was moving, that he was no longer stuck. And that insight, simple but powerful, marked a turning point, because Ethan began to understand that transformation does not come from a single win. It comes from becoming someone who keeps going even without one. And for the first time, losing did not feel like the end. It felt like part of something bigger that he was finally stepping into. The next morning, nothing looked different. The same small apartment, the same quiet street outside, the same routine waiting for him. But Ethan felt it clearly. Something inside him had shifted in a way that could not be undone. And instead of waiting for motivation or a perfect opportunity, he made a simple decision. He would continue, not because he felt confident, but because he no longer trusted the version of himself that quit too early. And that decision changed how he approached everything. He created a small routine, waking up at the same time each morning, sitting at the same spot by his window, spending one focused hour improving his skills, not for anyone else, not for immediate results, but to prove to himself that he could stay consistent. And at first, it felt slow, almost meaningless. The progress was not visible. The days felt repetitive, and there were moments when doubt returned, asking what difference 1 hour could really make. But this time, Ethan did not argue with the doubt. He simply continued, day after day, building something quiet but powerful, discipline. And with that discipline came clarity. He started to notice patterns, understanding where he lacked experience, where he needed to improve, and instead of avoiding those weaknesses, he leaned into them, learning, practicing, repeating, and over time, that 1 hour turned into more, not forced, but natural. Because he began to feel something he had not felt in a long time. Progress, small but real, and as weeks passed, the external world slowly began to respond. Conversations felt easier, his posture changed, his voice carried more certainty, and people started to notice, not because he was trying to impress them, but because he was no longer trying to hide. And one afternoon, while working on a project he had given himself, his phone rang again. Another opportunity, another interview. But this time, the feeling was different. There was still nervousness, still uncertainty, but underneath it, there was something steady, something grounded, a belief not that he would succeed, but that he could handle whatever happened. And as he prepared once again, he realized that the biggest change was not in his skills, not in his situation, but in how he saw himself. He was no longer the person waiting to be chosen. He was becoming the person who showed up ready. And that shift, invisible to others but undeniable to him, was quietly reshaping everything. Because the more he acted like someone who was focused and capable, the more real that version of himself became, until one day, it no longer felt like an effort. It felt like who he was. When Ethan walked into the second interview, the room felt familiar, but he was not the same person who had walked into the first one. Because this time he was not there to prove his worth. He was there to express it. And that subtle difference changed everything. The way he sat, the way he listened, even the way he paused before answering, no longer rushing to fill silence with uncertainty, but allowing his thoughts to form with clarity. And as the conversation unfolded, he noticed something he had never noticed before. The interviewer was not looking for perfection. They were looking for someone real, someone who understood challenges, someone who could think, adapt, and grow. And for the first time, Ethan felt aligned with that. Not because he had suddenly become perfect, but because he had experienced struggle and chosen to move through it instead of hiding from it. And when they asked about a difficult moment in his life, he did not avoid it. He spoke about his setbacks, his doubts, and more importantly, the shift in how he saw himself. And as he spoke, his voice carried something new, not just words, but conviction, a quiet confidence built from consistent action rather than empty belief. And when the interview ended, there was still no guarantee, no promise, but there was a sense of completion, as if he had fully shown up as the person he had been becoming. And as he stepped outside, the sunlight hitting the pavement, he realized something deeper. He was no longer chasing approval. He was building identity, and that identity was no longer fragile, no longer dependent on one result or one opportunity, because it had been formed through repetition, through discipline, through choosing to act differently day after day. And over the next few days, something interesting began to happen. People around him started to respond differently. Conversations felt more engaging. Opportunities appeared in places he had not noticed before, and even simple interactions carried more weight. Because when you change how you see yourself, the world begins to reflect that change back to you. Not instantly, not magically, but gradually, in ways that build over time. And then one afternoon, as he sat at his desk reviewing his notes, his phone rang again. And this time, when he answered, there was no hesitation, no surge of fear, just a steady presence. And as he listened, hearing the words that confirmed he had been selected, it did not feel like a sudden victory. It felt like a natural step in a process he had already committed to. And in that moment, Ethan understood something that would stay with him far beyond this opportunity. The result was not what changed his life. The process was, because by the time the world recognized his growth, he had already become someone entirely different on the inside. On his first day at the new job, Ethan arrived early, standing outside the building for a moment before walking in. Not because he was unsure, but because he was aware of how far he had come, aware of the person he used to be who would have never believed this moment was possible. And as he stepped inside, everything felt new. The environment, the people, the expectations. But instead of feeling overwhelmed, he felt focused, grounded in the process that had brought him here. And as the days turned into weeks, he approached each task with the same mindset he had built during those quiet mornings in his apartment. One step at a time, one improvement at a time, never rushing, never assuming he had arrived, but always learning, always adjusting. And something interesting began to happen. His consistency started to stand out. Not because he was the most experienced, but because he was the most present. He listened carefully, asked thoughtful questions, and took responsibility for his growth. And the people around him noticed, offering guidance, giving him opportunities to take on more, trusting him with tasks that once would have intimidated him. And each time, he accepted, not because he was free from doubt, but because he no longer allowed doubt to decide for him. And one afternoon, during a quiet break, Ethan found himself standing in front of a glass window, his reflection staring back at him once again. But this time it felt different. The same face, the same person, yet something had clearly changed. His posture was stronger, his eyes more focused, his presence more certain. And as he looked at himself, he remembered that moment months ago when he had stood in front of a mirror filled with uncertainty, asking if he had been wrong about who he was. And now, without needing to say anything out loud, he knew the answer, not because someone had told him, not because the world had confirmed it, but because he had lived it, step by step, choice by choice, building a version of himself that once felt impossible. And in that quiet moment, he understood something deeper than success, something more lasting than any job or achievement. That transformation is not a single event. It is a series of decisions repeated over time. And the person you become is shaped not by what happens to you, but by how you choose to respond to it. And as he walked away from the window and back into his work, there was no need for celebration, no dramatic realization, just a quiet certainty that he was no longer the person he used to be, and more importantly, he was no longer limited by the story he once believed. Months passed, and what once felt like a distant version of himself had quietly become his reality, not through a single breakthrough, but through hundreds of small, consistent choices that no one else had seen. And one evening, as Ethan walked home after a long day, the city lights reflecting softly on the streets, he noticed something he had not paid attention to before: the absence of that old voice, the one that used to follow him everywhere, telling him he was not enough, questioning every step, holding him back before he even began. And it was not that the voice had disappeared completely, it was that it no longer had power, because Ethan had learned something far more important than confidence. He had learned awareness, the ability to recognize a thought without becoming it, to hear doubt without obeying it. And that skill had changed everything, because it meant he was no longer controlled by the story in his head. He was choosing it. And as he reached his apartment and stepped inside, the same space that once felt like a place of limitation, he paused for a moment, looking around, remembering who he used to be in this very room. The late nights filled with overthinking, the mornings filled with hesitation, the endless cycle of waiting for something to change. And he realized that nothing in the environment had forced his transformation. The space had stayed the same. The circumstances had been ordinary, but his perception, his actions, his identity had shifted completely. And that is when the deeper truth became clear, not just for him, but for anyone willing to see it, that being broken is not a permanent state. It is a temporary belief, and being lost is not the end. It is simply the beginning of a different direction. If you are willing to question the story you have been telling yourself, because the moment you do, even in the smallest way, you create space for something new to grow. And that growth does not come from waiting for the perfect moment or the perfect feeling. It comes from choosing to act differently, even when it feels uncomfortable, even when it feels uncertain, because every action you take is a signal to yourself about who you are becoming. And over time, those signals build into identity, and that identity shapes your life, just as it did for Ethan. And as he stood there in silence, there was no need for validation, no need for proof, because he already understood something that many people spend years searching for, that you do not become strong by waiting to feel strong. You become strong by acting in spite of feeling weak. And you do not become focused by hoping for clarity. You become focused by choosing where to place your attention again and again. And in that quiet understanding, his story did not feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning, one that would continue to unfold with every choice he made moving forward.